Ask any writing instructor what they think the most crucial element in a story is other than a strong plot, and they will tell you that an unforgettable, relatable character is it. However, it's hard to imagine exactly how important characters are when you're a newer writer, or if you've been doing this for a while and you realize that you've been on autopilot and you haven't been giving it all the thought and weight that perhaps you should. So in this episode of the podcast, we're going to be talking about characters, why they're so crucial, how you can write a character that's relatable, which surprising elements actually make a character more effective than another one, more unforgettable, more relatable, more real, because after all, that's what we're looking for. In a character, we're looking for that dose of reality. We're looking for that truth, which is what makes a story transcend a simple, fun story adventure and become something that is life-changing. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Hey, welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. I'm writing coach Karena Akhavein, and I have a lot of experience with helping authors to tweak their characters to make them really sing and feel super multidimensional and real to the reader. I know how a bad character can sink a novel so fast, and I'm really into fixing that. And that's why in my course From Idea to Published in 6 months, I spend quite a lot of time helping writers to develop their characters through worksheets, through journaling exercises, through brainstorming, and then through good old-fashioned practice. I think that these things don't happen automatically, but when you do start creating characters that are dimensional and complex, you can really tell the difference. It's like a switch has been flipped in your writing. Characters are the heart and soul of any good story. They are essential. Characters drive your plot. They are literally the ones whose actions and decisions are going to shape the events of a story. Their actions, decisions, reactions create conflict and tension. The relationships also do this. Characters are going to engage the reader. Without well-developed characters, your reader cannot really get into the story. A story with these fabulous, unforgettable characters is going to be such a gift for your reader. When a reader gets connected with the character, they become invested in the story. Think about it. You don't care what happens next if you don't care about the character. You don't care about the stakes if, according to you, the character could stay or go. It doesn't matter. So you have to be really, really connected. The character needs to be relatable, and that is something that enriches your story immeasurably. Characters convey the theme of your story. You know, your story will have a theme, it will have a message. We don't want it to be too overt, but by showing exactly how characters are dealing with challenges and overcoming obstacles in your story, this is how we can show some kind of a moral or some kind of a message, the life lessons that our readers are going to be learning from watching these characters. Characters do create these emotional connections that makes the story so impactful, and it can really help a reader kind of extend those emotional truths into their everyday life, and it really makes them feel like they're connected to something bigger than themselves. So it's actually quite a magical alchemy that happens when you have a character that is complex, deep, and that resonates as being real. So well-developed characters add that depth and complexity because they add the human element. That's what's so important. That's what we look for. We look for the human element. We look for that thing that is common to us in humanity. And so when characters have flaws and they have motivations, they have backstories, that's when they start to become more realistic and relatable. So it's really important to make sure that your characters are well developed and memorable, but it's really easy to mess it up and it's easy to skip over some of these things. As a writing coach, I have so many writers coming to me with stories that have a pretty cool plot, but I can't get into it. And when I really think about it, the common thing that all of these books with plots that feel weak have, the common point is not enough stuff going on. The common point is that we're not relating to the characters enough because the reader is not feeling that the character is developed. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about the mistakes that many authors make with writing characters, but especially we're going to be talking about tips and techniques that can help you to create these realistic and engaging characters that your reader will absolutely love. Get ready for some awesome, actionable tips that are going to help you immeasurably. So let's get the negative stuff out of the way. Let's talk about the key mistakes that writers make when they're developing characters. The first big mistake is creating one-dimensional characters. And it's funny because I know that so many writers enjoy writing characters. They enjoy coming up with a character, and many times they do give them a personality and they do give them a backstory, but too often these characters are a little bit too stereotypical. So I would really challenge you when you're looking at your characters, see what you're communicating about them, because sometimes in your head, your character is really complex and unique, but then you know so much about them that you don't really communicate those things to your reader, and that hurts the experience of reading your book. So think about that. Think about dimension and depth and complexity and uniqueness. And the backstory is one of our big tools in kind of bringing this to life, but also there are mistakes that people make with the backstory because, they'll info dump about a character. We don't want you to do that either. We'll talk about backstory a bit more in a bit because it fits into your story arc in a really interesting way. Another big mistake that writers make is that they'll be describing their character and what they describe is largely physical. And I'm sure that you've seen a few videos of mine if you watch me on TikTok, or if you've been in writing group with me, or if you've been in office hours, you know that I have this thing against describing too much of a character's physical appearance and focusing on physical attributes, especially when we have the tendency to write our characters as being more attractive than the average. I think that using this beauty filter, as I call it, on our characters and then describing their physical appearance really robs the reader of that emotional connection that they could have. So I want to know about your character's personality. I want to hear about their motivations. I want to hear about what they're obsessed with, and I want to know enough about them that I can guess how they're going to react to any given situation in your book. And I talked about motivations. That's a huge mistake. Oh, it's such a big mistake that I see writers making. Too many writers have these goals for their characters, but it feels weird to give your character a goal, right? You're like, this is not a work exercise. We all have goals, but do we act on them? Not necessarily, right? Well, that's why I recommend giving your character an obsession. And we need to give that character some reasons why they're obsessed. We're going to be talking more about this in just a bit, but having a really clear motivation in the form of some form of obsession that can be driven by lust, by guilt, by being power hungry, any of those things, that is going to establish really clear motivations that make your character seem consistent when they're acting. Consistent doesn't mean predictable. I want your characters to have enough, contradictions in their personality, a mix of, strengths and weaknesses that's quite unique, that makes them far from flat and that makes them far from predictable, but makes them logical. Another huge mistake that too many writers make is that they make a character super static. Their character has certain traits and they maintain those traits throughout the story. And of course, people don't change fundamentally in some ways, but in your story, to make it interesting, your character needs to go through a character arc. A character arc is where your character starts to change. They start to grow. They start to learn. Neglecting to give your character a clear arc can make their actions seem super arbitrary and unrelated to the plot, which becomes really kind of annoying because your reader is like, what's the payoff here? What am I going to see in terms of the payoff? Because a satisfying ending is one where your main character has gone on a very real personal journey. And they have to have changed. If they end up exactly where they were, I think that officially makes a not very satisfying ending, no matter which plot points have happened. Another enormous mistake that writers make is that they make characters too perfect. And I know why this happens. And we'll be talking more about this in just a bit in this episode. That perfect character is called a Mary Sue. The Mary Sue is a character that's far too perfect, and they become boring and unrelatable. The reason writers do this is pretty interesting, and I'll tell you about that later. But let me just say that it's important to make characters flawed and more realistic and relatable. If they're perfect, they're boring or unlikable. Another issue that writers will have is that they write in kind of a void, and their characters exist in a void. And they ignore character relationships. So it's quite interesting when characters have relationships, right? There are too many stories that I see where a character will be acting as if they were completely alone, even though they are surrounded by people. But people have relationships all the time. They have friendship relationships. They have relationships of, professional relationships. They have sibling relationships. And these relationships can be fraught. They can be complex. They can be ugly. They can create tension. They can create comfort. So ignoring and neglecting these relationships definitely makes characters seem disconnected from each other and from the plot, and it robs your reader of that extra dimension that they could be getting. So I think that we definitely want to look at avoiding all of these mistakes. And I know it sounds like, oh boy, you've given us all these mistakes that we're probably making. And you think, maybe I'm not making these mistakes. Maybe you're not making all of these mistakes. But I think that each one of us, including me, and I've been working as a writing coach for a long time, when we write our stuff, there's like this shortcut that happens. And I think that we skip some of the steps that go into making a great character. So let's talk about the basic foundations. Even if you've been writing for years, I think it's always good to go back to basics. So let's talk about that. What are the basics of great characters? Listen, writing a dynamic character in your novel, it really requires planning. And that's why in my course, From Idea to Publish in 6 Months, I have a whole segment dedicated to planning these characters. It's a whole separate job that happens before you start writing scenes, I believe. Now, if you're a pantser and you don't like planning so much, and you feel like your imagination kind of doesn't get to work as well if you are planning characters out ahead of time, try writing a couple scenes featuring your characters and then try to work on making them deeper and seeing what makes them tick. And then maybe you can have those things in your head, brave you, but you can, make your characters more dynamic and multidimensional after having examined how you're naturally writing about them. That can work. But if you're a planner and if you want to try this and, go into these tips, the first thing to do is definitely to establish a backstory. Now, careful. This backstory is not going to 100% make it into your book. You're not going to info dump your backstory. You're not going to have chapters before anything happens in your book where you say, Peggy was born in so and so year in, South Carolina, whatever. No, your reader doesn't need to know the things that aren't crucial to what's going on, but you as an author should know your character's history because this does shape their personality and motivations. So if you know their backstory and it's compelling, at least all of that explains to you why they act the way they do. And then your reader will start to determine through their actions and through dialogue, things like that, wow, all of this seems like it makes sense to this kind of person that we're talking about, right? Sometimes it's nice if your reader wants to guess what happened to your character in the past. That's pretty cool, right? So you've got the backstory, some bits of which you can release and show, and some parts of which will stay in the background and can be guessed at. Now, we talked about the goals, motivations, or obsessions that you should give your characters. This is really, really crucial, but it's important to know. Remember how I said that your character grows and changes? Well, I think that the goal should be something that evolves throughout the course of the story, because when your character starts off, they are a very different person. They're not as evolved. They're not as matured. They're not as knowledgeable. So their initial goal or motivation might be simplistic, or it might be self-serving. And one of the ways that you see that your character has changed and grown is when you see that goal evolving over the course of the story. An evolving goal pushes the goalposts a bit further so that your character is forced to keep growing, forced to keep going, forced to keep pushing to keep getting what they want, right? If they had this small goal and it stays the same, chances are they'll get to it pretty quickly with no change needed. And, that'll be easy peasy. But let's pretend that your character's initial goal is to win the lottery because they want to support their family. And let's say that they spend their last pennies buying a lottery ticket and then they don't win, or maybe they do win, but then they realize that that's not the actual goal that they have, right? Their goal and their obsession is taking care of their family. So let's pretend their goal was to win the lottery. They do everything so that they can go buy that lottery ticket. And now they win. And now they realize that their winning actually is going to put their family in danger. The character is now forced to deal with a whole new set of circumstances, and they have grown financially. They're going to be forced to grow emotionally, mentally, all of that to catch up with that. It's fascinating. So think about all of those options that you have for a dynamic character. We're going to talk a lot more about character arcs and everything else in this episode because that's really important, but that's crucial. Another thing that you definitely want to create is you want to create conflict. Conflict is so important. You need challenges and obstacles to your character. I see a lot of young writers who write for escapism. And some of my younger writers, or even older writers, you live in a situation where your real life is a little tough. You've got these relationships that are hard. You're going through some emotional or psychological stuff. You might be having problems at work. And then when you're writing, you're like, you know what? I want to write a story that's just happy-go-lucky. I want my character to go through this wonderful story, with no conflicts or obstacles. And then you soon see that this creates something where we're just kind of plodding along. When we don't have this conflict and we don't have these obstacles and we don't have this tension, the reader doesn't feel like they need to keep on reading because they're like, well, it looks to me like this character has it all figured out and that there aren't going to be any surprises and they're just going to go through this plot with nothing terrible happening. And so I don't need to worry about them. I don't need to have that, suspense of what's going to happen. The character development, as we said, is so important. And when your character has conflict with another character, they're really forced to examine themselves. And, sometimes those types of conflicts aren't enough to force big changes. It takes much bigger conflicts to do that, which are called pinch points. And I'll be hitting on those a little bit when we talk more about that arc. But really think about conflicts large and small, tension large and small, and how you can use that within your story. Now, in terms of your character and showing what your character is like, as I described, just writing a description that's physical and emotional, saying, Susie Q was really pretty and she was really nice and super generous and she liked to feed puppies, that's great. But I would rather see that stuff coming out through dialogue and internal monologue and actions. This will really help the reader to understand what your character is truly like and how their characteristics lead them to behave, act, or react in a certain way, and how they might be changing as they go along. Now, you've always heard that you're supposed to make the character flawed, and you might wonder, well, isn't it more admirable to have a character that's pretty perfect? Why does my character need these flaws? No one's perfect. And even the most perfect person is probably not perfect because they're too perfect, right? So you definitely want to give a character these flaws that make them relatable, and that they have to overcome some of these flaws, and also maybe learn that some of the things that they valued, that they thought were absolute strengths, are weaknesses. And that becomes kind of interesting because that way their flaws and weaknesses are less stereotypical, right? We don't want to use these tropes, right? If you have a character and she's a single mom, she's the plucky single mom. She's getting the kids ready for school and running to work, and she's doing it all alone, and she's so brave. And okay, that's nice, but that's a trope. We need this character to have some other stuff going on, in her mind and in her life to make her a little bit more dimensional and interesting and unique, right? So try to see if you're looking at your character and you're thinking, okay, this is a bit of a stereotype, or this is a bit static. This doesn't feel exactly like a real person. How can you do that? How can you make your readers think this character is so very real? And I said that your character is going to change, and that the reason that you're giving your character flaws is to make them relatable. You make them relatable because, again, as I mentioned, your reader will not care what happens if there's not that, kind of attachment to the character. You want the reader to want to see the character succeed, right? So that's why their goals and desires have to be really specific, but also relatable, right? So what does your character want more than anything else in the world? They can want something pretty specific, but how does that become relatable for your audience? How is that universal? And then have your audience thinking, what am I willing to do to achieve my goals? Or what am I willing to do to pursue my obsession, right? That really becomes very, very important to the reader. So let's backtrack to our backstories. So we know that backstories are important. You know that a backstory is the past of your character, right? And this includes, of course, where they were born, where they grew up, their experiences, if they have siblings, if they're religious, what their parents were like, what school was like for them, anything that really shaped them into the person they are today, in the today of your book, right? So again, as I mentioned, you might want to go online and you can find these character forms that ask you, what does my character think about this? Or what's their favorite blah? Or what do they like about that? Or what was their worst relationship? All this stuff. But the thing that I do differently in my course From Idea to Publish in 6 months with my character worksheets is that I reframe all of the questions so that they actually apply to your story. That's really, really important. Now, you don't have to get the course to do this, but just keep in mind that when you're seeing these basic worksheets, transform those questions so that it really does relate back to your story. We don't care about the details that don't affect your character today. So really, really important. So think about, what's their personality like and how's that going to affect the character arc? That's the important part. So think about doing these sheets and filling everything out to use as a reference tool as you write, because you want your character to be dynamic and to be changing, of course, but you still want that consistency, right? You want people to know that, oh, this character would do this and totally wouldn't do that, so that if they're forced to do something that they clearly would not want to do, it's going to hit your reader that much harder. So let me give you a little exercise to do in terms of writing this backstory, because it's not just about, their favorite color. That's fine. As I said, like, let's try to relate this back to our story. So one idea that you can do is that you can determine what the most significant events in your character's backstory are. And these events could be positive or negative. And they can come from any stage in their life. In fact, it's better for you to have these significant events kind of spread throughout. So maybe like an early childhood negative or positive event, like maybe when they were little, they got lost in the shopping mall. And it took their mom like 3 hours to find them. And the security guard was nice, but kind of creepy, and now they have this fear of being left behind. For example, that's like one thing that could have, worked. Then teenage years, maybe they had, their first relationship was kind of messy. And then they were very, very dependent. And when they broke up with this person, they lost all their friends. But then they learned to stand on their own 2 feet. So that could be both negative and positive. They've learned to be independent, but they also maybe don't trust people as much. Right? And then you think recent past, maybe last week your character had a really bad review at work, and this is going to color their behavior. They had that bad review. They're kind of thinking, hey, screw you about their boss, but they're also thinking, oh no, I might get fired. Think about how that is really going to be impacting their behavior, their actions, reactions, thoughts, goals, all of that good stuff, and their relationships. When we have something going on in our lives, or when something went on with our life, we relate to other people differently. So it's important for you to realize that. And speaking of people, a next thing for you to do is to identify who the influential people were in your character's life. Right? We all have influential people in our lives, whether they're family members, our mom or dad, or maybe that friend we had growing up, or maybe the babysitter who taught us how to knit, or maybe a stranger that we noticed, across the train car, but they looked like they were living their best life and they left a lasting impression. Or maybe we have a mentor, and our mentor has kind of told us to go against everything that we believed. And, they're trying to shape our relationship to our family, and we're kind of wondering what's going on. That's really important, right? Think about these people in your character's life who are still in it or not. All of that really, really will transform how your character deals with everyone around them and how they act and react. Because it's really important to think about your character's response, right? I talk about, fear and responses and logic. When we're faced with something, we all have a tendency to react in a certain way. So they break down people into 2 categories, right? That the people, if something, pops up, they have fight or flight or freeze. Right? 3 things. And generally, if you tend to fight, you will always tend to fight. If you tend to freeze, you will always tend to freeze. And that will extend to other things in your life, not just physical dangers. So how does your character generally respond to significant events in their life? And how do they respond to influential people in their lives? Right? Things like, do they rise to challenges, or do they crumble under pressure? Are they forever putting things off? Do they tend to make friends easily? Do they tend to screw their friends over easily? Do they make enemies easily? Do they tend to be kind of codependent in relationships? And, all of these things, these tendencies, think about all of that and how this is going to shape the plot of your novel now. Now, the next thing that you might want to do, this is not as necessary, but I think that it's cool to create a timeline for your character, because it kind of helps you to be consistent. And, if you need to mention anything, you can kind of refer back to that. But just a quick timeline of your character's life with their significant events, people they meet, things that happen, any things, their marriage, their graduation, their adopting a pet, whatever, all of that stuff. But you have all of this. You need to have a well-developed backstory, but remember that you do not want to overload your readers with too much information, right? So remember that you're using this backstory only when it's necessary to understand motivations or behavior. So it's kind of interesting because one of the books I wrote under my pen name, I had a book club for it. Well, I didn't. They invited me to a book club, which was really, really fun. And, one person who'd really read in detail, and it was really great, she was saying, I didn't understand why this character did this. And it actually kind of bumped her out of the story. And I was like, oh, no. I thought I wrote that. And then another person in the book club said, no, I read that character, this happened to them, and that's why they did it. It makes sense. And I was so happy that, another reader had realized that, yeah, it actually makes sense because now we know that element of the backstory. But what that feedback also told me was, okay, maybe I need to drive that point home a tiny bit more, right? Sometimes the backstory mentions are too subtle. So kind of interesting. There is a balance that you need to feel out. And this is one of those moments when you're definitely going to want to ask your beta readers whether there's enough backstory or whether the motivations of your characters' actions and everything else are believable and consistent. That's a really, really key question you're going to want to ask. So I mentioned no info dumping in our speaking about the backstories, and you're like, great, that's nice. Well, how do I bring that stuff into the story? How do I bring that stuff to life? Well, probably through dialogue and action. And even inner monologue, things like that are going to be the best tools so that we don't have any weird info dumping or so that we're not pulling the reader out of the story. Because rewinding and explaining, Johnny is reacting badly because he's afraid of snakes because when he was little, he was attacked by a snake and it was really bad and it scared him and it made him think that, no, okay, you don't want to do that. And many writers will create a, kind of flashback, but you want to use flashbacks sparingly. So I think the best way to bring backstory to life is through dialogue and action. So dialogue specifically is an essential tool for revealing your character's personality, their beliefs, their motivations, their relationships, right? We all want to make sure that our characters have a really unique way of speaking. That alone completely reflects their personality and background, right? And also, when you're doing dialogue, you're able to show the conflict between characters. Well, conflict is often created by a difference, right? A difference in background, a difference in personality, a difference in morals, a difference in energy. All of those things are going to create conflict and tension. So without really spelling it out, you're able to show how your character really is. And through showing that conflict, you're advancing the plot and you're able to reveal that important information. So when you are advancing this plot through the conflict, you also are going to have some action. You can definitely show your characters doing things that are consistent with their personality and their backstory. And you can use this to create suspense and conflict and tension as well. So imagine you've got two characters and they're sitting there and they're having, kind of a conversation about one thing. But while they're having that conversation, you see that one of the characters is straightening things up, but they're in the other character's apartment. And the character is showing these traits of being, a little bit OCD, but also a little bit not appropriate, or there's some familiarity there because, why are you reorganizing things in this person's apartment? So you see how now we're giving added levels of meaning, backstory, and, emotion and, all of that great stuff through a simple little action of cleaning the apartment as they're talking. And also cleaning the apartment, maybe they're not listening to what the other person's saying, right? So there are a lot of traits that come out in one simple action. And then you have the other things that come out in the discussion, right? And remember that with a dialogue, you're not always focusing on what's said. Sometimes there's the stuff that's unsaid, the interruptions, the lapses, all of those things are crucial, right? So while this character is cleaning up, the other character can be like, really? You always do this. And the other character says, not always, remember? And then the other character cuts them off. And the reader goes, ooh, something interesting must have happened once between these two characters. Let me kind of create this mental map of what that means that each of these characters is about, right? So that's very, very important. I talked about how your character must be not static. They must be dynamic. And to be dynamic, they need a character arc. Very important. If you have a protagonist who remains the same and they don't change, they're not going to be as compelling. They're not going to be as relatable. But you have heard the term character arc a million times, but you're like, I don't really know how to write one. It feels really artificial to do this, you know? The only reason it does is because too many people in our everyday life don't have main character energy. That's right. A lot of people don't really go through a character arc that's that compelling. You know, maybe they swear they're going to change their whole life and they never change and figure it out too late. You know, that happens in real life, but in a book, we probably don't want that to happen. That's not a really great story. So how do we establish a character arc? We start with the starting point. Imagine that. The starting point is that baseline situation that establishes who your character is at the beginning of the story. So starting point is early in the story, usually within the first few chapters. And I really like to tell my writers that I would like to see your character in these first scenes doing something that is part of their everyday life. And through this doing something, they are going to demonstrate some of their strengths and some of their flaws. They're going to show what's important to them, and we're going to get a hint at what their obsession might be. We're going to have a hint also at what's problematic in this situation. So that's really, really important, that starting point. And you want your reader to have a good grasp of who your character is really fast, because unless we have a good grasp of it, unless we started relating to your character, we do not care what happens next. We don't care about their goals. We don't care about anything else. The next step in the character arc exactly is define the goal. The goal, the obsession, you know, whatever it is. So the goal could be a million different things. It's something that the character wants, whether they want to have it, want to achieve it, want to find it, want to experience it, right? Your goal could be a physical object. It could be a relationship with a person. It could be an emotional state, like, I want to be happy. What do I need to get there? And your character's goal at first is going to be a little bit problematic and maybe simplistic. And maybe it's shaped by the fact that your character doesn't quite know themselves as much as they could. So that's really important. So now the next step in your story character arc is establishing the obstacles and challenges. A journey towards a goal should never be easy. If it is boring and predictable. So definitely introduce the obstacles and challenges that are going to force your character not only to, go beyond what they thought they were going to do, it's going to force them to change their approach and confront their flaws. And that takes a mighty big obstacle, right? It doesn't mean just having to step over a length of rope, to cross the path. It means you get to something and there is a really major problem. And I call this a pinch point. A pinch point is when you see kind of what the stakes are, how horrible things could be if your character doesn't get what they want. And you see that the character really is going to need to change because these obstacles are insurmountable if they don't change their approach in some way. And often changing your approach forces growth, right? And when your character starts to experience growth, you're going to show that through actions, dialogue, and internal monologue. It's totally fair for your character to be resisting change for a while. It's totally fair for them to be questioning what's going on, but eventually they're going to figure things out. And this might not be the way that the reader would particularly, solve things. It's not the way you would solve things, but it's the way that's logical to your character. So the final part of the arc is that you're going to resolve the arc, the resolution. I talked about how an ending is not satisfying if the character's not changed and grown, right? Whether they've achieved their goal or whether they've found something else that's equally meaningful or maybe more so, that doesn't matter as much as how your character has changed, what they've learned, who they are today. So I think that that's a really important thing to realize, is that, if they go on this search and it's, easy enough, or the obstacles are small enough that they just keep going and they remain themselves, there's no stakes really, and then they get the thing they wanted, that's not a compelling story. Also, you're definitely going to want to think about, at the pinch points I talk about, the really tension-filled points where your character realizes that they must change, that, there are huge stakes and that their obstacles are really too massive to overcome without, changing. Find some way to have some kind of really interesting imagery or symbolism. That's a great tool for showing your character's moment of change in an unforgettable way. And always make sure that the character's actions, reactions, decision, and dialogue are consistent with where they are on their character arc at that moment, right? So you can't have your character, being at point A where they're still a little bit, they're ego driven, and maybe, they don't really know what they want, and maybe they are, kind of selfish, and all of a sudden they're just going to do something really selfless. Your reader's going to be like, what are you talking about? No, they want to see that character growing first, and then you can have them doing something that they never would have done before. Similarly, when your character has already gone through quite a bit of growth, if they go back and do something that's more logical for who they were before, you're going to need to explain that thing to make it really realistic. That's super crucial as well. So I really want to see these characters, changing and growing, but I want to also touch just on that last thing of why so many of you have a big issue with writing flawed characters. I think that we have this whole issue with likability. And I get it. As writers, we are isolated often, and, we're all also part of a community, whether we're close to it or not. And as human beings, being rejected from, our group of peers or our society, that evolutionarily is very dangerous. You don't want to be rejected, so you don't want to show the ugly side of yourself unless you're a sociopath. You really actually care what people think. So when you're writing a character, you fear that the reader is going to associate them with you. And you know what? If you have friends reading your book, I guarantee there's a good chance that they will do that, whether you like it or not. So one of my books that I wrote, my readers who knew me, they're like, oh my God, that part was so cool when you were doing this and that. And I was like, honey, I have never, decided that at a certain age I would jump from rock to rock, and I would never, go to this place and do this alone. And, all of these things that I'm like, that is not me. The character is not me. But so definitely it is a thing that happens, which is why sometimes writing under a pen name or having beta readers who don't know you as a person is really, really precious, because feel free to write characters that have not only flaws, but ugly little flaws. A Mary Sue is never a successful character. Self-insertion is never great. Whenever I hear someone saying that they're writing a book based on their life, I'm like, oh no, it's not going to be great, because you're going to be afraid to dig down deep into the ugly side. However, I do know writers who do this really well, but I have to say that it's because their ego swings in the other direction, where they want people to know them warts and all. I think that's kind of interesting. And they're the same people who are like, tear my work apart. And it's like, no, I won't do either one. I will critique your work. But I think that is quite interesting that some people are not willing to explore the ugly flaws. So think to yourself, what's a flaw that I've seen in someone I love? But that's a pretty disgusting flaw, that somebody who didn't know them and love them might think that they're a bad person. Now that starts to be a pretty compelling flaw, right? If you have a friend who's delightful, but then once in a while, they steal things or something, and you forgive it because it's your friend, right? But somebody else who didn't know them would be like, gross, that's horrible, that's inexcusable. It's your job as a writer to make your character relatable and then introduce that flaw that's ugly and that creates this originality in the character with motivation and that kind of, impacts your character, right? Maybe they get caught. Maybe they have to stop stealing things in order to get where they want, right? So that's kind of interesting. Another problem with the Mary Sue that I really think is problematic is that they're usually too smart, too strong, too good looking. Hello, how can they have any obstacles impacting them negatively when they're pretty darn perfect and when they're so good at everything? Well, it's not very realistic for example, a character that grew up in the middle of nowhere to be fluent in 5 languages and, to know how to do kung fu. These things are kind of silly. So you really have to watch out that your characters go through these learning curves, right? They go through moments of messing up when they're trying to get a new skill, or they go through moments where they thought they had the strength to do something, but they don't. Those failures make them just as compelling as their strengths and as their successes, believe me. So if you are compelled to write a Mary Sue, and if you think you're going to make yourself look better by writing a Mary Sue who's similar to you, I would just say don't do it. And so one exercise I give my writers is I'm like, okay, look at your character and tell me how they're similar to you and how they're different. I'm like, you really need to make them different. And some people will tell me, oh, I did make them different. I gave my character blue hair. I have blonde hair. Honey, if that's the only thing that's different about your character, that's not enough. You need to go back to the drawing board and you need to really think, how can I do something that is unforgettable? I know that you're unforgettable, but you're unforgettable with all your nuances, not just with only the positive points brought up and exacerbated. So again, if you are really curious about the best way to write a fantastic character and to incorporate them into your story, you might be really interested in my masterclass From Idea to Published in 6 months, because it really is going to hone those skills for you. Or you might want to be in Writing Coach on Demand, and that way you can ask me about your characters. We can work on different ways of making your characters really nuanced. I'll give you a hint is that you can use multimedia approaches. If you are a Writing Coach on Demand person, you're going to be getting a bunch of extra materials that are showing you how to make nuanced characters and how to build that character arc with all the pinch points and everything. I'm going to have some fill in the blanks exercises for you and some really cool ideas that are going to help to make those characters that much more unique. So consider joining Writing Coach on Demand. Go to my website, www.creativeandwritingcoach.com. If you want to take the class, the course is sitting on onlineCoursesForWriters.com. Could it be any easier? So I hope this helped. I hope you feel really inspired to write a super cool, nuanced character. I would love to hear about how that's going for you. So feel free to email me or reach out in any other way. And I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.